Hello, and welcome to Curious Appetite. Thank you for joining. I'm your host, Nola Man, and we're going to take a little journey to the origin of some of your favorite foods. Today's item, doughnuts. You ever notice that the really good doughnuts are made by local independent shops? Some don't even have names. They just have a big sign that says Doughnuts. The best doughnuts are at 4 a.m. after being up all night. First, you're starving, so everything's going to taste better. And secondly, they're just coming out of the fryer. It's like French fries. They're okay when they've been under a heat lamp for a while, but it's a completely different experience when the grease is still glistening. You'll also notice it's becoming really popular to sell them in pink boxes. This originated only in the past few decades out of Southern California. The 944 box, as it was called, 9 inches by 4 inches by 4 inches, fit a dozen perfectly and was traditionally white. But independent Asian donut shop owners in the LA area, specifically Cambodian refugees, were looking to minimize their expenses and found that the pink 944 boxes were a few cents cheaper than the white version. Also in Asian cultures, white is associated with death and red is for good luck, so pink has to be better than white. Now, LA loves their donuts. The average ratio of Americans to donut shops is about 30,000 to 1 across the U.S., but in LA, 7,000 to 1. Okay, enough with the sweet talk and on to the origins of donuts. First off, just about every culture has a sweet delicacy that involves taking a bread dough, frying it, and adding some sort of sugar mixture to it, either inside or on top, right? I mean, the Germans have something called the Berliner, Italians have a fritelli, the Spanish have the churros, and even each of these is regionally based, so it goes on and on and on. So to say that the donut is unique, well, that would be an overstatement. But the donut as we know it is American, but clearly with international influences. So where to begin? Donuts, limiting the definition to deep-fried cakes, have a long European history and roots still even earlier into the Middle Eastern cuisine. But how did they get to America? Well, they were introduced to America by the Dutch in the 1600s when they colonized New Netherlands, our present-day northeastern states. Remember the story where some group of colonists buys Manhattan Island from the Native Americans for like $24? Yeah, that's them. But back then, they were known as olykoeken, or oil cakes, made of yeast dough rich in eggs and butter, spices, and dried fruit. And their sweetness came from the fruit and then a final dusting on top with sugar. The dough was often somewhat sticky, and you needed additional flour to toughen it and mask the spicy and buttery flavors, and was dropped into blobs off the end of a spoon in hot rapeseed oil. The resulting donuts took the form of kind of irregular balls, even being called at some point oliebollen or oil balls. They were eaten during the Dutch Christmas season, which extended through New Year's through the 12th night, January 6th, and also for special occasions throughout the year. Okay, so we have the donut, or at least a sweet fried dough in America, but when does the hole appear? I mean, to me, that is what makes a donut, the hole. According to the National Bakers Association, we need to credit the hole to Gregory Hansen. Now, Hansen's mother had been making olykoeken for him as a child, and Hansen was now 15, and he was a galley boy aboard the ship Ivanhoe in the year 1847. The day? June 22nd. Now, dough that was deep fried in cauldrons of lard had been served to sailors on the seas for centuries. But they were not the donuts we know today. It was just a blob of dough, and the center would remain greasy and partially cooked. They were so dense and doughy and uncooked that the sailors called them sinkers. Hansen gets this idea to lighten the sinker. He takes the tin cap from a pepper canister and uses it like a cookie cutter, and he cuts out the center of the oily cakes. Then, when the cakes were fried, they were completely fried through. They were all the rage aboard the ships. Hansen's mother even introduces the innovation to landlubbers, selling them at a friend's general store in coastal Maine. Gregory continues to live a dramatic life of high seas adventure well after his teenage discovery. He delivered supplies, lime most notably, from New England all the way to San Francisco in the wake of the California gold rush. The journey takes him around the dangerous sea of the Cape Horn at the tip of South America. Along the way, Gregory rescues 7 Spanish sailors from drowning aboard a sinking ship, and his fortitude earned him honors from Queen Elizabeth II of Spain herself. His final years were actually spent in Quincy, Massachusetts. In fact, if you visit his burial site in Quincy, it even states on his gravestone that he's the inventor of the donut. Now, his legacy as the inventor of donut was even elevated further during the Great Donut Debate at the Hotel Astor in New York City in 1941. The captain's relative, Fred E. Crockett, spoke in defense of the family. Now, there was this Cape Cod attorney, Henry A. Ellis, that sought to dismiss the Crockett-Gregory family claim with a long story that the donut can be traced back to a scuffle between Pilgrims and Native American people in 1620s, in which an arrow was shot through a ball of dough of an Englishman. Now, Crockett defends the family, puts forth all this supporting evidence, and Captain Gregory was the unanimous choice of the judges. Now for the interesting coincidence. Captain Hansen Gregory is not the only person in Quincy, Massachusetts with a connection to the donut. In fact, less than a mile as the crow flies from his gravesite, you will find a donut shop that was started by William Rosenberg. Rosenberg, donuts, doesn't really ring a bell. William Rosenberg, the son of immigrant Jewish parents, was operating an industrial catering business in which he sold snacks in converted secondhand trucks near factories around his native Dorchester, Massachusetts. He noticed that the donuts and coffee accounted for 40% of his sales, and in 1948 launched a donut shop called the Open Kettle in Quincy, Massachusetts. 2 years after opening, Rosenberg changed the store's name to what? Why, Dunkin' Donuts. And 5 years after that, arranged the first franchise. By the time Rosenberg dies in 2002, there were more than 5,000 Dunkin' Donut shops in 40 countries serving nearly 2 million customers each day. Fun fact, Entenmann's Bakery in Carlisle, Pennsylvania is the largest baker of donuts in the U.S. It makes out of its one factory about 100,000 donuts every hour, which is roughly 15 million a week. Now, the U.S. recognizes 2 separate days as National Donut Day. The first occurs on the first Friday of each year in June. Soon after the U.S. enters into World War I in 1917, the Salvation Army sent a fact-finding mission to France. The mission concluded that the needs of the U.S. enlisted men could be met by canteens or social centers termed huts that could serve baked goods, provide writing supplies and stamps, and provide clothes mending services. Typically staffed by 6 members per hut, they would include 4 female volunteers who could, quote, mother the boys. About 250 Salvation Army volunteers went to France. Because of the difficulties of providing freshly baked goods from huts established in abandoned buildings near the front lines, there were 2 Salvation Army volunteers that came up with the idea of providing donuts. They were an instant hit, and soon many of the soldiers were visiting the Salvation Army huts. The women who did this work were then known by the servicemen as donut girls. So on June 7th, 1938, as a fundraiser for Chicago's Salvation Army, they declared it to be National Donut Day. And their goal was actually to help out those in need during the Great Depression by handing out free donuts and to honor the Salvation Army donut girls of World War I. November 5th is also recognized as National Donut Day. There is documentation as early as in the 1930s in copies of the Ladies' Home Journal to prove this. There is speculation that it was selected due to its proximity to Veterans Day, again, a link back to the Donut Girls. While not all donut chains celebrate both dates, brands like Dunkin' and Krispy Kreme have been known to give donuts away on both dates. But most consider the June date as the more official of the two holidays. Now, the first printed recipe for donuts can be found in a cookbook dating back to 1803. Washington Irving is believed to be the first to use the phrase donuts to describe the Dutch treat in his 1809 writing, A History of New York. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow author described donuts as balls of sweetened dough, which were fried in hog's fat. Yum. If you look around, you will see two spellings of donut. One spelled traditionally D-O-U-G-H-N-U-T, and a shortened version replacing dough with just D-O. While Dunkin' Donuts using the shortened version might get the credit for making it popular, they didn't invent it. In fact, bakeries had been using it since the 1920s. The spelling was actually invented by the New York-based company Display Donut Machine Corporation. They said they did it to make it more pronounceable. Either spelling is correct, although you typically will only see the traditional version outside the U.S., unless you visit a Dunkin' Donuts in Saudi Arabia. Yes, they have a store there too. That brings us lastly to a baker's dozen. Request a dozen eggs from a farmer or a dozen steaks from a butcher, and you will almost certainly receive 12. But a baker's dozen is commonly understood to mean 13. Where in the world did that come from? In medieval England, there were laws that related the price of bread to the price of the wheat used to make it. Bakers who were found to be cheating their customers by overpricing undersized loaves were subject to strict punishment, including fines and even flogging. Even with careful planning, it would be difficult to ensure that all of your baked goods come out the same size. There may be fluctuations in rising and baking and air content, and many of these bakers didn't even have scales to weigh their dough. For fear of accidentally coming up too short, they would throw in an extra, just to make sure they were safe. So that's it for this episode of Curious Appetite. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Nola Man, and until next time, stay hungry.